Hey everyone, you're listening to the first episode of Chat Sematary. Hopefully, you checked out the trailer to learn a little more about the podcast before it launched here. But if you didn't, just a quick recap. I am going over Stephen King's work and adaptations in mostly chronological order here. I'm not breaking down each short story by when it was first published in a magazine or anything like that. I'm just going by when they were collected and published in book form. So won't quite be 100% chronological, but it'll still be pretty close here. And today I have on Mirjani Rawls to talk about Carrie, which is Stephen King's first published novel. Mirjani, how are you doing today?
I'm pretty good. Good to be on.
Yes, first guest.
That
Although we have
I
done
am.
many a podcast together, so it's kind of just another day for us.
Yeah, I know. It feels like we're just breaking ground again.
Yeah, so I wanted to start this podcast basically because I have been paying more and more attention to Stephen King's works lately, especially with the large amount of adaptations that are continuously being announced, it seems. You know, you have some that are really fantastic, some that are not so great. And, the same can be said for his books and short stories and everything, too. Obviously, there are going to be ones that really stand out and ones that people maybe don't like quite as much. But I think with Carrie, this is a book that has stuck with a lot of people just because, it's his first published book and it went on to be adapted quite a few times. Again, some better than others, but I know
Yeah.
you are going to be back on the podcast to talk about at least one of those adaptations in the future.
Yeah, the I guess the not so good one.
One that I have yet to see, but it will happen before we do that podcast. But for anyone who doesn't know, Carrie is a 16-year-old girl who is from Chamberlain, Maine. A lot of Stephen King stories take place in Maine, so this isn't surprising one bit. And her mother is a fanatical Christian fundamentalist, and that sort of drives a good chunk of the story, just the relationship that Carrie White has with her mother. And then she goes off to high school and has her own set of traumas happen there. And then we learn along the way that she has some telepathic abilities. Obviously, if you have not read the book, we are going to be spoiling it. So here's your warning. And that goes for pretty much every single episode after this as well. But MJ, was this the first Stephen King novel you picked up, or did you start somewhere later down the line and then sort of went back and visited his first book after already reading something else?
I actually started with The Shining, and then I went to Misery
Okay.
because Misery is like one of my favorite stories of his. And then I went to Carrie. I went to Carrie after I've seen the movie with Sissy Spacek the first time. And I was like, okay, like, or let me read this. Like, the movie's kind of crazy, especially the end, which we'll talk about later, book wise. But the movie, I mean, if you haven't seen the movie, she kills everybody. But yeah, I was interested in this book because, like you said, it was his first one that got published, and we actually talked about it before the podcast and stuff. Like he actually threw the first three pages in the garbage,
Yeah.
and his wife like fished him out. So like, yeah, I was interested to see like how he wrote it and how it was different from the movie.
One of the things that's nice about this book too is because it was one of his earlier works, it wasn't quite as lengthy as some of his later works tend to be. And, obviously with books like The Talisman and those are very, very lengthy books. Even The Stand, which wasn't too much later than Carrie, but the first edition copy of this in hardcover was just under 200 pages. It comes in at 199 pages, which is extremely short for a Stephen King novel. Some of his novellas seem to almost hit that number. So it's one of those
Yeah.
things where, he was obviously still in the early days of sort of figuring out his style and everything he wanted to do. And I remember reading, it might have been in the On Writing book, but it could have been somewhere else, that when he first went to his publisher or editor with the book, the editor was a little worried about him shoehorning himself into being a specific type of writer. And you and I both know that he has more than just horror stories, but for the most part, horror is where his focus is at. And he will always, not always, but a lot of times he'll put these little sort of sci-fi fantasy elements into it as well, which I think helps sort of just change up the stories a little bit, because he's someone who has well over 60 novels at this point,
Yeah.
or short story collections included in that number. And I think, my mom and I finally have almost all of his books. We're missing a few of the more recent ones and maybe one or two of the older ones, but it's one of those things where my mom had started buying the books when they were coming out in mass market paperback. So she has a ton of copies from, the 70s and 80s and through the 90s. And then once I started getting into his books, I sort of convinced her to start picking them back up again. And we've almost completed the collection, which, as I just said, it's a lot of books. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And, I didn't start with Carrie either. I honestly don't recall which book I started with. It was either the Green Mile books or The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon, because I
Okay.
remember those were two of the early books that I had read. And I think I read The Green Mile first because my mom has the serialized books, so they were super short. So I was like, oh, look, this one's only like 90 something pages, 100 pages. So, I sort of plucked through those fairly quickly. And then I believe Cell was another early one I read, and then I wanted to go back and start from the beginning. So I more recently read Carrie, but like you, I had seen the movie before reading the book. So it was one of those things where I was like, I'm very familiar with the story. I might as well go back and read the book. And I've sort of been mostly going in chronological order now, which will help greatly for this podcast.
Like you, I've kind of like parsed my way down and tried to read all his books. Like you said, they do get lengthy
Yeah.
towards the end. So like, like you said, like he doesn't only do horror, which is kind of like nice. And there's like this whole like every Salem's Lot is another favorite one of mine. Probably like you mentioned Cell. He's done stuff just for like Amazon for the Amazon Kindle. Like he did Your for that. Yeah, like I've always been a big fan of his, and apparently, if you look at the box office now, apparently Hollywood is too, because
Yeah.
there's tons of adaptations that either came out or are now coming out now that are coming down in the pipeline. Like and especially with like Carrie and like some other books, like the message that he tried to convey, they actually like it stands out now. Like this book was written in the '70s, but like the story of like a young girl who gets picked on and stuff like that, and wants revenge. You know what I mean? Like you can kind of resonate with that now, which is pretty cool. But I'm glad that his wife Tabitha picked that out of the trash for him, because like I'm like, all right, well, he just threw Carrie away.
Yeah. One of the things I want to talk about here too is the fact that he probably didn't do this purposely when Carrie was published, but he sort of started this world building. And while this doesn't take place in Castle Rock like many of his stories do, it is still set in Maine, and we have Miss Desjardins. I don't know if I'm pronouncing
Yeah,
that correctly, but that is a name that pops up throughout the years. There is someone with that last name in The Body, which was later adapted into Stand By Me. And it's just interesting to see how, he took this one teacher from Carrie and was like, okay, we're going to keep this last name and sort of have it appear throughout the years in his stories. And now, even in 2018, that's a name we're seeing. So I think, Carrie isn't the best book he's ever written, but I think it was a good starting point for him. And, like we mentioned, it was his first published book, but I believe it was his actual fourth novel that he had written. And, he wrote it on the same typewriter that he used to write Misery. And, it was his wife's typewriter. So you probably have to be like, okay, clearly the wife, Tabitha, was a huge influence on him sort of getting his start, because I know she has also published books, but I don't think it has been at the same volume by any means, because Stephen King is a hard dude to keep up with. It's 2018 and he has at least two things coming out this year, not including the plethora of adaptations.
Yeah, I know that I was reading um, that like they were talking about him and Tabitha, and like he was writing short stories at the time, and like women were like saying like you can't write about women, and she's like, well, yeah, you can, and I know he was having trouble with the very beginning of the book where Carrie gets her period the first time, and he was like going on this whole like at first like it was supposed to be like this like I guess metaphysical like metaphor, and I guess she like helped him like simplify it into something else, which is kind of cool. Like you know what I mean? Like uh, it definitely helped him from like a man's perspective to kind of like, all right, well, to have like a woman there to like kind of parse that idea and like you know uh, make it real and make it real and have like a realism to it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. And obviously, bringing in the telepathic abilities, that's something that is less realistic, but it makes the story a lot more interesting, because she is sort of realizing that she has these powers around the same time of that incident in the locker room. And he does a nice job with some of the character building for Carrie in this story, because the tension with her mother is there, and that is definitely present throughout the entire story. And then some of that ends up transferring onto the students, because her mom hasn't given her sort of this information that is crucial to just being in high school, and
Yeah.
she isn't able to cope with that as well as she probably should. So it's one of those things where you have all of this anger building up in her, and now that she realizes she has this ability, you see her, or you read about her accidentally using it, and things will go out that she's not trying to have go out, like lights will break and everything. And by the end of the story, she's able to control it and direct it quite a bit more. So you see this progression with her throughout the book. And, like you said, that we get this big ending, and it's sort of a relief when we get there too. We're like, okay, we see exactly why she felt this way throughout the whole story, and it was all leading up to that. And like I said, this book isn't as long as many of his others. I don't know if I can name another book that comes in at under 200 pages for the first edition. I mean, maybe there's one, but I can't think of it off the top of my head.
Yeah, like you kind of see like this journey through Carrie specifically in the book where she's terrified, she doesn't know what the hell is going on. You know what I mean? Like her mom is like this super religious fanatic, and like you find out later, you're like, oh well, I kind of get why, but at the same time, she doesn't really like it. The relationship that she has with Carrie is strictly based on this faith that is oppressive, and it's funny that like Carrie gets this power, like the telekinesis that like is anything but that. Like she can move stuff with her mind. You know what I mean? She can manipulate that. Like that's especially the Margaret, like witchcraft.
Right.
But Margaret, I think, mentions in the book where like it manifests in her family every other person. So I think but yeah, you see that, and I think yeah, Carrie goes and tries to explain having her period to her mom, and then she's like, "Well, it's the woman's curse," and then and throws her into the prayer room. Um, but then you see like Carrie like practicing her abilities, strengthening them, still like with Tommy Ross and whatnot, and like having the she's growing out that way. She's like being outgoing and going to the prom, and then the damn pig's blood happens, and she grows into another way. At first, she walks out of the high school, and then she's like, "Oh, I got this telekinesis," and then just kills everyone like brutally. And then Chris and Billy try to run her down, and then she takes the car, which is funny because just like going to the movies real fast, that's not in the first movie. It's
Hmm.
actually in the other movie that we'll talk about. And I was like, why didn't they keep that scene? But yeah, she grows that way, and then she finally stands up to her mom. But then she realizes, oh shit, like I killed my mom. And then Stephen King, when he talked about this, like I think he like this was a stand for feminism, and like I could kind of see why because like like Margaret just stands for like she's just a metaphor for like this like religious sect where like you can't have sex, you can't embrace your sexuality. We're just not going to talk about it. You know what I mean? And then when it happens to you, you're just kind of on your own. And then when you come to me, like it just wasn't a very good mother-daughter relationship. And then when you find out what happened to Margaret, which I guess like she had marital rape or whatnot, like then it comes into the whole thing of experience like that changing you forever. You know what I mean? Like that's why Margaret is the way she is, and that's why Carrie is a product of that union, and she doesn't. I don't think she loves Carrie. She's just like, well, this is just what I have to deal with from that union.
Yeah, I want to quickly discuss here just the time period for this story too, because it was released in 1974, and it's definitely a story that feels very of the time. You know, while high school can still be rough for kids today, it wouldn't quite be like what we see in this book because with social media and the internet and everything like that now, it's almost something that is worse because it exists outside of just, that high school that you're at that time. It's something that people everywhere can see. But for Carrie, this was a series of traumatic events within the high school. We have the locker room incident at the beginning, and then we have the buckets of pig's blood that is dumped on her and Tommy at the prom because they have rigged it so that she is prom queen, which, Carrie knows that something is up with this probably. And obviously, we then get that scene where she just loses it, but in a more controlled way than she had been previously. She's upset with all of these people for doing this to her because obviously a lot of people had to vote for her to get her to actually be prom queen. And it's one of those things where, Carrie isn't stupid. She knows exactly what they're doing, and she just kind of can control the rage at this point, but also kind of doesn't care if she doesn't.
Like even teachers were laughing at her when that happened. Like, you mean like you got the whole school and like teachers laughing at you?
Right.
Like that's crazy. Like when you think about it, can you really blame her? Like, you know what I mean? Like she's been repressed her whole life. She's been hearing that everything is a sin and like her happiness is a sin and her going to the prom is bad and blah 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 and she just lost it and it just happened that like the telekinesis is just a conduit for that and she just let go and just well I mean that prom I know like the government at the end like they say it's just an isolated incident
Right.
and that teases something that I'm sure we'll talk about but I mean what a way to end a prom that's all I can say.
Yeah, and you only really have two people in this story who ever sort of feel bad for Carrie. You have Sue Snell, who finds her at the end after all the chaos has happened, and then Carrie is able to forgive her, and then you have Miss Desjardins who ends up resigning from her job, but she realizes that, maybe she was the person who could have helped Carrie if she had tried a little harder.
Yeah, because Miss Desjardins, didn't she like scold her in the beginning when she found her, like when she had like her period for the first time, and then she was like, "Oh, you didn't know."
Right. Yeah. She sort of has this reaction like, okay, come on, what are you doing? And then it clicks with her that, oh, you actually don't know what's going on right now. So, that switches pretty quickly for her just within that same scene, pretty much in the book. And you're like, okay, here's someone who would potentially be on Carrie's side and might end up being a little more of a mother figure to her than her own mother is, but by the end you still have everything that's happening. And in the book, Carrie realizes that Sue and Tommy just sort of wanted this to be a prank, but it obviously went further than they had anticipated. And Carrie is still able to realize that, Sue wasn't really vengeful or anything like that. So she forgives her and then dies because she has basically exhausted herself so much from using her powers as much as she did.
Yeah, I think in the book it may have hinted that Tommy started to like her a little bit.
Yeah,
So like there was some like, and then Sue actually tried to do the right thing. Unfortunately, for Chris and her boyfriend, like they saw different and did the ultimate prank that got everybody killed. Uh, yeah, it's weird because like with this small town mentality and whatnot, like obviously everybody knows everybody and whatnot, and I don't know, like especially like from seeing like the movie and like stuff like that. Like I always wondered, like, did Carrie know? Like, did Carrie know that this was kind of just like a pity date, kind of like you know what I mean? Like they're like, we should really do this. And I know Carrie's hesitant, but like, why would I knew that Carrie, when she got to the prom, especially when Tommy's friends are all like accepting of her and stuff like that, like, was it just her want to be normal just to kind of be naive at that moment? Because like you have to be like, all right, well, all the popular kids are liking me. You know what I mean? Like, why? What's going on here? I don't know.
yeah, and we see the loss of Tommy as well, and that is literally moments before she locks everyone in the gym and has the sprinkler system go off, even though there's a lot of stuff in that gym during a dance that certainly cannot get wet.
Yeah, that's definitely a horrible way to die, getting electrocuted.
Right.
And then she started the fire that, like, well, nobody can get out. So, like, even if you weren't, like, you were going to burn to death. So, and then she destroys the town too,
Right.
breaks power lines. She, the gas station explodes. And, like, then she, like, broadcasts, like, a message that, like, she did it. So, like, yeah.
There's definitely a lot of death in this book because you have multiple people, one, trying to kill Carrie throughout the story. Her own mother stabs her, and then Carrie turns around and kills her by stopping her heart. And then you have Billy who tries to run her over. And in the end, she ends up dying because of her own actions, pretty much. So it's one of those things where she is very adamant, pretty much, about going out on her own terms. She's like, you guys did this to me. You're all going to pay. And I am going to get what I want by the end of it, even if it means the end of her.
Yeah, it's kind of, yeah, like you said, like it's kind of poetic, right? Like realizing like this power that you have, using to a full extent, and then just like being so tired and exasperated that you die from it. Like it's just like, all right, well, since she has this power, like I really doubt that like the cops would stop that. You know what I mean? She would just kind of, if they shot bullets at her, she'd probably deflect them or something like that. And like her story was really confined to this town and what they've been doing to her. And I guess her purpose was for vengeance. And then once she got it, like her, it wasn't meant that that she was supposed to be here anymore. And then she just passes away.
Yeah, well, do you want to talk about that section where we have the congressional hearings now? Because, it kind of leads into this grim situation for the city in general.
Yeah. Did you want to start or?
Sure, I'll just quickly go over what happened here. And, basically, we have those congressional hearings and we see the White Committee report. So, basically, because of what happened with Carrie, you have this sort of government cover up, and they're very adamant that Carrie is the only one who is able to cause this much destruction and it won't happen again, which, it's a Stephen King universe. Worse things are going to happen anyway. So that's kind of pointless. But then you have the town that is essentially a ghost town. And it's sort of just this sad story for the entire town because Carrie has locked pretty much all of the high school kids in the area in the gym and electrocuted them and then burned the place down and sort of just ran rampant through the town until her last moment. And obviously, there are still people around, but for them, it's probably not worth staying in this town where this horrible thing happened. And it just ends up becoming this place that tourists go, which is something, we see in Castle Rock too with Stephen King stories. While that town isn't abandoned, so to speak, you can definitely still get a very similar vibe from that. So, this scenario at the end of Carrie here, it's something that sort of plays out throughout other stories too in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, 440 people died. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
how do you just pick up from that? Like, how do you like, well, gonna go back to work on Monday. You know what I mean? Like, so like that becoming a ghost town, I took as it being like for the people who did survive, it being kind of a mission of guilt. You know what I mean? Like because the town kind of caused it. Like the kids like picked on her. Everybody kind of drew a blind eye until it was too late. And I think they mentioned that the town kind of like became of a legend where people would go and just kind of visit to see like the legend of Carrie White. It's become like what you would see like from Ghost Adventures, like from oh well, this hotel is abandoned, but you can still feel the presence of the bellkeep who got murdered here or whatnot. It's become like one of those haunted house type things, which is weird. Like from like a thriving small town, and then all of a sudden, like one incident wipes everything free. Um, a neat thing that I like in this story in this book that they tell, that Stephen King tells some of the story through newspapers and letters and book and then like excerpts and stuff like that. If you look at like horror movies now, and I'm pretty sure, like we've talked about, like they've drawn a lot from Stephen King. The whole like epilogue and like teasing of like a sequel or stuff like that. Well, I mean, this book kind of does that. I know, the government's like, well, this can never happen again, and then all of a sudden, like you read a letter from a woman from Tennessee saying like, oh, I have like this kid, and she's writing to her sister about her daughter who's Annie, and she's like floating marbles. And then she mentioned that like her grandmother can do the same thing.
Right.
And like you said, like world building. If you've read any other Stephen King book, there's a lot of bad stuff. There's there's usually not one occurrence of the same thing, and for the government, and it goes back to what Margaret said about the telekinesis being it jumping from every other generation, you're like, wow, now it happens um, in somebody else. So it was kind of like a key teasing of a Carrie too, like this can happen again.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, he didn't write a sequel to the book, but we have seen, like I said, quite a few different types of adaptations come out of this single book. And it wouldn't be the first time for him to revisit some of these older books and write more current sequels to them. You know, that's something we see with The Shining and Doctor Sleep. Those books are decades apart. So I wouldn't put it past him to, write a Carrie sequel necessarily. I don't think we'll necessarily get that though, but it's something that is probably always going to be there just based on how he closed out this book. It's like, okay, will he or won't he do something that spins off of this first book for him? And another interesting thing just about the process of getting this book published is that he didn't even have a phone at the time to find out that a publisher wanted to print this book up for him. So he had to get a telegram sent to him in order to find out. And, his advance was $2,500, which probably seems like nothing today, but back in, the 70s, that's a good chunk of change. And
Yeah,
we have certainly seen how he went from this struggling writer before Carrie started, and even possibly, throughout the publication of Carrie and everything like that, because it's one of those things where one book is not going to make you super rich right off the bat. And he has been working at this for so long that he's just sort of built up this, I don't even want to call it a cult following because he's on the bestseller list frequently. It's pretty much every book that he releases now. And, people are always talking about his work. And like you said earlier, Hollywood clearly loves him. So, and his stories. So it's one of those things where, obviously he gets money from a variety of different places. And, the first adaptation for this, we won't go too much detail on it because I will have a full episode on it. But the first adaptation came out, what, like 2 years after the book? So it was started very early on in his career that his stories were being adapted for film. And I think that is something that gave him a lot more leeway to continue creating these stories and not necessarily having to worry about money just to get by.
yeah, and even after that film adaptation, I know there were two other stories that came out around that time. There was The Fury. I actually recently read that and watched that. It's a movie with like Kirk Douglas about telekinetic abilities, and then there was Jennifer too. The story that like Stephen King said that he couldn't even believe he was writing. He's like, who's going to care about a girl with like menstrual problems? Yeah, it grew into not only a big thing for him, but it was kind of like a big thing for, that female like heroine type, especially with like mental abilities at that time. Because like you gotta remember, like I think right around that time he wrote that Rosemary's Baby came out, The Exorcist came out. So it was like dealing with women who had these religious like afflictions, one with a devil child, and the other one, little girl gets possessed. Now you see like a woman that like uses her powers to overcome the religious afflictions and things of people. So like it was a good story for him, and I think he said that when he got the advance, he like bought like a car with it. I think he bought
Yeah,
a new like Ford
a Pinto.
Pinto. So
Yeah. It's such a 70s car to buy.
yeah, I know. Then he was able to like resign from teaching from it, and then he was actually able to live his life as a writer, which is awesome. Like you and I are both writers, and like to see like a writer grow like that, like it's a good feeling. It's a good story.
Yeah, and even though the hardcover didn't sell super well, by the time it came out in paperback the following year, it ended up selling 1 million copies. So, like I said, it didn't happen right when he released the book. He got that advance, he bought a car with the money, and then the paperback rights were bought for a significant amount of money, and it sort of all just snowballed from there, but snowballed in a great way for him. This is something that allowed him to, like you said, quit his job and just focus solely on writing. And we see how that's paid off all of these years later, too. He's still churning out books like his livelihood depends on it, even though he's probably very well off at this point.
Yeah. Oh, that guy's got to be set for life. But, like one of his principles is writing every day and reading every day.
Yeah.
And like I know like just from reading his works and stuff like that, like that's something to be admired. Like, he could probably be on an island somewhere, you know, working with Hollywood studios just kind of like selling the rights to his books, but he's still writing voraciously, which is kind of crazy, but it also really, really cool.
Yeah, it certainly gives us a lot of episodes to do for this podcast. And is there anything else that you want to touch on, or does that pretty much wrap everything up for talking about Carrie today?
Yeah, I think we did like a pretty good job. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where you have to go back to his beginning works to really understand who he is as a writer. And obviously, you and I have both read this book. We've read some of the earlier books like The Shining, The Stand, and his short stories as well that came out during that time period. Salem's Lot is the next book coming up, I believe, here, if I am remembering things correctly. I literally had to build a ginormous spreadsheet to keep all of this straight. So, expect plenty more episodes. I believe just based on the spreadsheet alone, I have over 150 episodes that we'll be planning for this.
So it's gonna be a healthy podcast.
Yes, yes, we're going to get quite a few years out of it, should I be able to keep up with it. I'm hoping that's the case, but this is something that is new that I'm trying out, and I'm hoping it goes well. And if you are listening to this, I just want to say thank you so much for checking this out. This has been the first episode of Chat Cemetery, and Marjani, thank you so much for being the first guest on the show to talk about this first published novel by Stephen King.
Yeah, no problem. Pretty sure I'll see everybody again at some point. But yeah, it's been fun.
And of course, as always, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.